I was born October 2nd, 1919 in Red Lodge, Montana. I like to dance. I grew up dancing because all the ethnic groups in Red Lodge were dancers, particularly the Italians and the Yugoslavians and the Finnish. And then the Scottish, Irish, English are where I fall in. Why, they were pretty good dancers, but they had to get in there and really dance in order to grow up there, because they didn't let you grow up unless you got to dance. I grew up in Red Lodge, graduated from high school there in 1937. Our classes were small, 55 with a number in my graduation class. We all went to war. Every one of us came back. Rather peculiar. And some of them went to the European theater, were in the Bulge, and others were in the South Pacific and going into some of the real bad battles. I went to work for Anaconda Copper Mining Company in order to let my brother start out to college. At Anaconda, I was inducted into the service. Went to Washington for induction and took a choice of with the Air Force, sent down to Wichita Falls, Texas, where I received basic training. While I was at Wichita Falls in church, and the announcement came over that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. There we received a choice of whether we wanted to go into the Army, Air Force, or whatever, and the particular branch of the Air Force, which was of course called the Air Corps at that time, and I chose meteorology. They sent me to school up in Chanute Field in Illinois. Just before I had finished my meteorology training, we got an urgent call from Australia, although I didn't know that at the time because they didn't make a habit of telling you where those calls came from, for weathermen. A group of us were taken out of the meteorology at that time and shipped off to California. In California, we went to Angel Island and received numerous shots, which included cholera, tetanus, cholera being one of the worst shots you've ever taken. When they shoot that into your arm, it feels like a sledgehammer hit you. We knew we were being prepared for something more than just a little stay over in Hawaii, but we didn't know where. The Queen Elizabeth had to refuel, and we stopped at the Marquesas Islands, where the natives rode out in their outriggers, tossed fruit up to us, and we tossed what they would want, cigarettes, back to them. I did smoke myself at one time, as most World War II people did, because there was a pretty girl standing on every corner here and in Australia handing out free cigarettes. How could you turn down a pretty girl who's offering you something like a little package of cigarettes? On board ship, the Mariposa, when we got out to sea, they decided they'd at least let us know a little bit about where we're going, because it was getting hotter and hotter, and they issued us our summer clothing. I never took those clothes off until I got back to the United States 4 years later, because we wound up down in Melbourne, Australia. We got into Melbourne, and the weather was quite cold at that time, even though that is their summertime, but it was cold down there. And they didn't have the facilities to put up these thousands of people who were unloading off the ships. They sent us out into the fields where we slept on hay, almost froze to death. They decided that it was time to send us on up. We got on the trains there in Melbourne and headed north. In Australia, they have a different gauge for every state at that time. And so when you got to Melbourne, being down in the state it's in, has one gauge. You got to New South Wales, where Sydney is, and you got to go to another gauge. So they had to unload the trains. Another interesting thing happening there was when they fed you, they had to stop the train at some station, and everybody got off the train, and the ladies came out and served their food to you. You got back on the train, went to the border, and then had to get off again in order to change trains. And we went to Sydney, then on up the coast. And Australia is a beautiful country there on that coast because that's where all the moisture falls. And we headed on up to Queensland and landed in Brisbane. And of course we had to change trains again at Queensland, where another gauge took place. Got into Queensland, or into Brisbane, and there I was assigned to the Brisbane airport, which later received all of the bombers from the States. The pilots were very friendly to weathermen. You were the last guy they saw before they left, and you were the first guy they'd like to see when they got back if you didn't get it just right. Meteorology is a basis for sending planes off, at that time, sending planes off into decent weather, or at least forecasted weather, so they knew what to expect over the targets. You receive information from stations all over, radio stations way out in the islands. Everything was coded at that time, and you had to decipher it and then plot it on maps. And you took shots of a balloon going into the air with a candle on it, is the way they had to do it at that time, to plot upper wind directions and speeds. And you did it with an alidade, which you could compute speed of the wind and at what height went into the clouds. They had from there, you took that information, plotted it on maps, and from the maps, you drew the isobars that tell you the pressures and the low and the high pressures, and from that, you were able to make your forecasts. I worked with an English and an Australian meteorologist there on the air base. Had the pleasure of seeing, what was that, Anthony Eden come in at one time. Then I received my assignment on to go to Cairns, which is up in northern Queensland. I found it really interesting to work with both the English and Australian weather people, and then the pilots, who I got to know extremely well. I also got a chance to work in Cairns with Dutch pilots. Dutch pilots are also very excellent pilots. They were from the Dutch East Indies, yes. Yeah, most of them had been raised there, and they were very unhappy about what was occurring over there, but were chased out and came to Australia to fly with them. I was particularly lucky to be attached to this Australian Beaufort Bomber Squadron. The Australians were flying the British Beaufort bombers and the British Beaufighters, both of which were real good planes. Possibly some of them later got into our planes, and they did get Spitfires later from the British. We were flying at the time Thunderbolts, P-38s, the B-26s and B-25s, which you may not be familiar with, but a B-26 was a very hot twin-engine bomber. The first one that came into Brisbane when I was there landed on the airport, and it was so hot the flyer could not get it stopped, and it went right across out of the airport, across the street, and into a house, finally stopping there. Later they extended the length of those airports so they could take on those hot planes. Nobody was hurt in that, but luckily but they had pretty well moved people out away from the airport, and they were bringing in the bombers in there. And when went to Darwin, the B-24s had taken over because the B-17s were more suitable for the European theater, short range. There they needed long range so we could be bombing Java, Sumatra, etc. They lost some, yes. Not a lot, but some. Definitely, the ground forces were pretty good in those islands out there in Sumatra, Borneo, all up and down through the Indonesia area, and they shot down numerous American and Australian forces. The airport officer at Cairns and I became very good friends. He was a Chinese, born in China but educated at Cambridge. He was a rubber planter down in Sumatra. Palembang, I believe, was his location, where he had rubber plantations. He flew a light plane and was an observer for the Australian Air Force there. They brought him over to Australia when they were chased out of the Asian area. Unfortunately, his wife and kids were all kept back there by the Japs. He had a very unusual request to make of me when I knew him, and that was there was one thing he wanted from the States, and I was able to get it for him from my parents. That was the Saturday Evening Post. He wanted that publication, and I was able to get him a subscription. I can remember one time in Cairns helping he was a civilian, helping he and his wife build a copper tub out in a concrete basin. That's how they washed their clothes. They did not have the modern wash facilities at that time that we did, and they were more in the scrub basin business. All the homes there in Cairns were built on stilts because of the tremendous rains there, because you're at about 15 degrees latitude, and there's a lot of moisture. Excuse me, you're more like about 10 degrees there because you're north of Rockhampton, which is right on the Tropic of Capricorn, which is 13 degrees south. And the homes were built on stilts to keep out of the water. Whether they do that now or not, I don't know, but that kept you up out of the water and away from the mosquitoes a little bit. You slept under nets all the time. There were no staying away. One evening, I was going home. It was late at night. I was going home on a bicycle, which wasn't, my home was not too far from the airport. And I had to go through this wetlands area. And I thought I spotted something with the light, and I stopped, laid down the bicycle. Here was a 20-foot python lying across the road trying to get warm. He was about that large around, so I expect my bicycle probably would have gone over him, but I'm glad I didn't. I was able to take a boulder and I cracked him in the head. He was pretty well, what's the term? Immovable at that time of night. I was able to crack him on the head and actually cut his head off, and took a stick and threw his body over into the wetlands part to hide him. But for days you could smell where I put him. I had a chance there in the 6 months that I was stationed there to go to the Great Barrier Reef a number of times. It's a wonderful fruit vegetable country, and the Australian people are just great. Anybody in America could go over there and have a tremendous fun time. The weathermen were moved around every 6 months. My next move was to Milne Bay, New Guinea. And when you go there, you're in another world. I had the opportunity and pleasure to fly up from Cairns to Millen Bay with General Blamey in his Sunderland flying boat. Uh, he was the ground commander of all forces there in the South Pacific, right under General MacArthur. When you come into Millen Bay, you are coming into the Lever Brothers plantation, covered with palm trees, and it's one of the most beautiful sights you'll ever see. And this flying boat just flew around the bay like this and gave me a great opportunity to see everything. And then you come down and land. If you've never been in a flying boat, why, you come down and land, and it sends out a tremendous spray out everywhere, and you have a great feeling. And since General Blamey and I were the only ones on board ship, well, I felt pretty good. He was very interested in young Americans, to talk with them and find out. There was no sense of he's here, I'm here. We were being bombed nearly every day by the Japanese. They were trying to find our Air Force, which was buried down in under the coconut palm trees, and of course you can hide it down there very well. I was in one raid where they estimated there were probably 1,000 airplanes came in wave after wave after wave. And it's a little scary when you're hiding down there in a open pit in the ground, which usually had water in it. And water in New Guinea is not like the water in your bathtub. It's a little muddy, a little gritty looking, but you got down in it because that's where you had to protect yourself. When those palm trees started coming down from the bombs, because they used a lot of anti-personnel bombing there, where the bomb hits the ground and scatters and takes down everything they can reach. When those palm trees come palming down, well, they were about royal palm height, and they make one terrific boom, and you can say you're scared. We were just so well hidden down under those palm trees that in spite of the fact of the huge numbers, the Japs really didn't know exactly where to bomb. The Owen Stanley Ranges are right there in back of you from the island. They go to 13,500 feet. So you had the peculiarity of fresh streams running down out of these mountains right into the ocean. Luckily, with the weather down there in Australia, you have the southeast trade winds, and they bring in moisture every day. The clouds in New Guinea would climb from about 500 feet on the bottom to 35, 40,000 feet on top, making the most beautiful sight that you've ever seen. This fellow from New York and I would be plotting maps in the early morning, say 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and in come flying mantises. You know what a flying mantis is? You can get them all the way from small up to the pencil size in New Guinea, and they're about that long, and they look like a pencil, and they have a head that's hinged. They move it around like that, and big goggle eyes and little arms up here. They would sit on our maps, and other bugs would come in. They'd dart out there and get that bug to eat, and it's real interesting just to watch those guys. After my stint in New Guinea, which was another 7, 8 months, where I had a great opportunity to mix with the natives who were actually educated by English, who were up there on these religious movements. They were great climbers of the coconut plantation. They climbed all the trees, got the coconuts down for us, and I had one boy from Good Enough Island, which is a little island just north of Millen Bay, who came down, and was working there. And he was 18 years old, and he had feet that splayed out something like this. I guess that's what gave him the great opportunity to climb those coconut trees so fast. In New Guinea, I had a funny experience, two rather odd experiences. One, I saw Joey Brown and his troupe come in there to entertain. Joey Brown was a marvelous comedian at that time, a contemporary of Harold Lloyd, another marvelous comedian, and people in that era, they came down to Australia and New Guinea to perform. The USO had a lot of them come in and do performances. We had big bands come in also from the States and Australian big bands and play in such places as the huge ballroom they had in Brisbane, Australia. We had a great time there dancing. I did get close to Eleanor Roosevelt, who came down there to visit us. She stayed with an engineering battalion, but she came around to see all of us, and it was rather a nice effort to get a greeting from someone who had recently been in the States. Of course, she was down in the Australian continent where we weren't actually having anything, although a submarine did get down into the Sydney harbor, but did not get a chance to do any damage until it got whacked. And they generally had the Air Force was keeping them out. The Australians were excellent pilots, and they were able to keep out Japanese. And I don't know whether it was General Blamey or General MacArthur's idea or their whole force that they stopped the Japs in New Guinea, never let them get in onto the actual continent of Australia. I had a chance, but I was not able to take it because I wore glasses, of going into the Philippines in advance of General MacArthur. They were sending weathermen in there by submarine, and but they took one look at your glasses and said, "You're not going." They couldn't afford to have you lose your glasses there and can't find your way out of the bathroom, and particularly when there were no bathrooms and there were no place to get your glasses replaced. You were on your own in that jungle. General MacArthur was very honored down there in Australia because it was felt that he really was the leader, and which he really was, and to save the Pacific from the Japanese. But from there I was transferred back to the mainland and of Australia, and went to Brisbane once again for a short stay. Then I was reassigned to Darwin, Australia, which is on the northwest corner of Australia. Darwin is like from New York to Seattle, that distance, and there's hardly anything but the Northern Territory and Queensland, the outback between them. Little village here or there, but nothing else. And so Darwin was alone up there where it could get bombed, and which it did by the Japs coming out of the Java. In Darwin, you think you're in the bush country, and you are, but it's really not a bad country. It's covered with little trees. The kangaroos, wallabies, wild oxen are everywhere. Darwin had been bombed by the Japanese flat. There was nothing left but tennis courts. We had our own shelters put up, and based there were B-24 bombers. In Darwin, while I was there, we swam out in the Indian Ocean. You could walk out into it for hundreds of yards, and it would only be belly deep. There you had to be afraid of, or alert, that the Portuguese man of war were everywhere. They were small, but they were very effective. When they stung you, you knew you'd been stung, and it was quite paralyzing. Unfortunately, we were able to stay away from them mostly and able to swim and get back to shore without getting brutalized by the things. I finished out my service there, which was actually at the end of nearly 4 years, and they transferred me back to Brisbane for disembarkation back to the States. They flew us back to Los Angeles, where I was began my separation at Santa Ana Air Base. For final discharge, they sent me to Monroe Air Base in Louisiana because that was close to where my folks were living, and that's where you could take your choice of where you wanted to be discharged. They would send you back to your home where you originally came from, but they sent me to Louisiana. I was going to school at the University of Arkansas, and I don't remember a whole lot about the end of the war. Went to school on the GI Bill. That was 1945. So I was able to complete school there. Although I had taken forestry basics, science basics in Antioch College in Ohio. Then I knowing that they didn't have a graduate forestry school, I transferred back to the University of Montana, where I could have finished forestry school, but there is where I was inducted into the service and never got back to forestry, which was extremely overcrowded field. I decided that when I went down to Arkansas, I'd just go to school there and complete my education. Because forestry and meteorology are in government hands, there is an awful lot of red tape. I decided I'd like to get away from some of that red tape, so I went into accounting. And you know how accounting is completely separated from red tape, like the Interstate Commerce Commission, all of the state regulatory commissions, the IRS. So I fell right back into the regulated areas, but didn't get away from government control. After I graduated from college, that was back in the good old days when you had a job before you ever graduated, because all of the companies came right to the campuses and picked you up. I was picked up there at the University of Arkansas by Bemis Brother Bag Company. I joined their accounting staff in St. Louis. I was on their traveling auditing crew. I stayed with that a year, which was a lot more than I really could stand, but I stood it for a year because I thought everybody ought to at least be a year on the job. Then I decided I've had enough of this traveling. We traveled every day except 2 weeks of the year when we'd get back home to St. Louis, which was not my home. And living out of a bag was not my way of life after having been raised in ranch country in Montana. I decided I'm going to come to either Minneapolis or to Denver. And I weighed the two. I had been up to Minneapolis on a job because Bemis Bag had a plant up there, and I liked that country, but I knew Denver was close to the mountains, and I loved the mountains. When I came to Denver in '49, you could go to work for any number of companies, and they were all looking for people. The oil industry was at its highest, and I first went to work with Texas Oil Company, and I stayed with them until they wanted me to transfer to a place like Houston or New York. I didn't quite want to go there, and so I changed and went to work for a trucking company, the Denver-Chicago Trucking Company, and I was there for 14 years. Then I went to work for NW Transport Service and was there with them through until I retired from work in 1983. I was in the accounting departments of of both of them, and became controller of NW at one time and retired. Moved into one of the great boarding houses down in the Capitol Hill area. That one was 14th or 16th and no, excuse me, that was 12th and Washington. That boarding house had all kinds of young men and young women there living there. That's where I met Lucy. And we met, fell in love, and got married 1951. And moved out to Sloan's Lake, where they had a strict rule: no babies shall live here. And we were a little bit pregnant at that time, and the baby was born, and they kindly allowed us to stay there for a month, and then we had to move. We moved out to Arvada. From Arvada, we moved to, when the kids were about 8 years old, we moved to Broomfield, which we had discovered had a golf course within walking distance of town. We wanted our kids to grow up learning the game of golf, because we loved the game so much ourselves. It was small. I think there were about 7,000 people here. It was a nice country town, which I was used to, having come from a town of 2,000 to 3,000 people. And I think we had about 7,000 here at the time. It's a very nice community. We've enjoyed it thoroughly. We joined the Broomfield Country Club when we first came here, and that was an area where we made a lot of great friends. Unfortunately, most of them were heavy smokers, and I can't think of one who is living today. And when I lived in Arvada, I was quite active in the Republican Party. I had decided to get real active in it, but I found that I could not go along with all policies of either party, and so I stayed away from active politics. My job was so demanding that I did not have time to spend with politics and my family and the job, and I wound up not really participating, but having an active background voice. I was for placing humps on the street, 6th Avenue, which slows down traffic. The city did not seem to go for that. My wife and I went up and made a study of it in Boulder on Dartmouth Boulevard, and they have all kinds of humps up there that slow down the traffic. And we took evidence from a number of the residents along the path of where these humps are, and everyone but one was for the humps. That one was a 19-year-old kid who thought they slowed him down a little too much. He said he was organizing to get rid of the humps. We went to the meeting with the chief of police, had his tape there that they had taken down in Littleton of the humps, and they took a picture. We said later that that picture was planned to destroy anybody's desire to have humps out in the street, because they used a pickup that I swore had rocks and loose tools in the back, and every time they'd hit one of those humps, of course, there'd be a lot of noise from it. And I said, you know, we went up to Boulder and we watched car after car go over these humps, and they're about 10 feet wide. They're not bumps, they are humps. And they're about 10 feet wide with a slow approach and an easy go over, but they do slow the traffic. We did not hear a single car make any noise that was annoying, and the residents who lived there did not think they had. We did talk to the police department in Boulder, and they felt that the humps inhibited their choice of how to slow the traffic down, but they still went along with them, and I've noticed that they've built considerably more humps up there in Boulder. We were not really for the conversion to a county here, thinking that there were too many unknown factors. We're not sure yet whether those factors have proved out that we were right, but I'm sure there are a lot of agencies here in Boulder that feel thankful that there is going to be one county, particularly the police who had to go to all the county seats to plead their cases. I think that growth was inevitable. We had the land out here. We had this Interlaken area, which was a wonderful area to develop, and Interlaken has spared no money nor dreams of how to develop it, and it's proved out the way that it is developed. The homes seem to be well developed here. I prefer small communities, but then if you live here and your kids live here, you got your roots down here, why, you stay with it. Our children are Mark, who was born first in 1954, and our daughter Sandra, who was born in 1957. Our daughter lives here, works for a small computer company here in Broomfield, and she lives over here on Hemlock Street. Our son lives in Boulder, up in Thunderbird Apartments, a very nice complex, and he works there when he can. And our daughter has one child, a 15-year-old boy who made the, lo and behold, the varsity tennis squad here in his sophomore year. And they went to Pueblo for the finals, where his team took 4th place. And hopefully this year, with him working at the ranch all the time, where he gets a lot of tennis training, he will be able to really make a dent in the tennis area around the state. I believe the schools have an excellent training program through the Boulder Valley School System. We've been very happy with it. You hear all the criticism of schools, but we don't seem to find that that's has any basis. We have not been a very close unit. We weren't a large unit. We were the 15th Weather Squadron. We were not a large unit, and we did have a couple of meetings, but they found, the organizer of that, I think, found it hard to contact all the people. They finally did get my name, and I received an invitation to go to Kansas City, but unfortunately, we had just returned from a 6-month stay in Florida. This was in 1988. I'd been away 6 months. I didn't feel like I wanted to be away anymore at all, and wasn't ready to take another trip another couple of days later after we got back here. And so I did not go to that reunion. There would be probably a few around that may be still living. Never have, but definitely would like to. I still remember a few people I knew there, both men and women, and I would love to get back to, because I spent so much time with the Australians.